Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Hello, salam, peace to you all. Had a little bit of a hiccup on this spontaneous live stream for office hours at our regular time, 5 p.m. Eastern. I'm really delighted to be with you all here on Good Friday. I'm, of course, Adnan Hussein. This is Office Hours, the 28th edition, if you can believe it, of our nearly weekly live stream. Before we get started with much more, I just want to welcome you all and, of course, say you can like the stream. In fact, I'd really appreciate if you would hit the like button, share it on social media, friends, colleagues, family, etc. Don't be miserly. Don't be stingy with a good thing. Hopefully what we will have is a really good kind of free-flowing, spontaneous, relaxed, chill out session to discuss what's going on in the world. So share it, and also, of course, subscribe to the channel if you want to support. You can, of course, patreon.com/Adnan, or on Substack, AdnanAHussein.substack.com. Of course, you can also do a one-time donation if you would like to contribute. Buymeacoffee.com/Adnan Hussein. But I do want to highlight an important fundraiser that I announced in the last two editions of the program, the live streams that I've done. The Spocks for Gaza, the small private online courses that are being run and organized by MIT students on their online extension platform, MITx. This is the third time they've been running this really wonderful program of being able to offer online courses for students in Gaza for their continuing education. As you know, they have been suffering only devastating genocide, siege, starvation, but of course also scholasticide, with the absolute disruption of higher education, of all levels of education. I saw earlier, the Gaza students were taking their exams and they were sitting on the beach, doing absolutely everything that they possibly can to continue to develop their minds, to learn, to improve themselves, and to contribute to their society, to their land, and to persist in insisting on a future for themselves and for their people. So I really feel this is almost a sacred trust and a sacred duty for me. I'm an educator. I do this online, public educational project for political education, to learn about history, religion, politics, to foster this sense of community for the public, people who want to learn, to come together and have these discussions. And I think the office hour really this program really exemplifies that, by trying to bring on scholars, sometimes just myself, but to open up opportunity to discuss and learn. So I do that for this project in general, but specifically, I wanted to do something, and I have wanted to for several years during the course of the genocide. And I signed up for various things that didn't come to fruition. So when I learned about this program, a colleague, in fact, a friend of the show and frequent guest, Professor David Yagubian, had colleagues who had participated, and he was plan on joining this program. He told me about it. I was really excited to be able to do something. So I'm going to be teaching a course this summer online for students in Gaza called Guerrilla History, Anti-Colonial Resistance, History Theory Practice. And the hope is that these students will not only learn something about parallel histories of anti-colonial resistance, but also have some historical appreciation for their own anti-colonial resistance struggle, and read some of the great classic theoretical works and some scholarship about this, but above all, be able to use their own experience of enduring occupation, war, genocide, to themselves be trained as guerrilla historians and to document experiences, to use history as a weapon in their own anti-colonial resistance, as historians, as archivists for their communities and for themselves. So that's the goal. And I think it's a worthy one. And there are a lot of other courses that are going to be offered. David Yagubian is going to do one on social biography, which is going to be great. It's about how you can kind of use individual examples to illustrate and elucidate a whole class of experience and to teach students the techniques for doing social biography. He is, of course, the editor of with Edmund Burke of a fantastic collection. I recommend it to everyone, of articles called Struggle and Survival in the Middle East. It's gone through 2 editions, and he's working on producing a 3rd edition, an updated edition with new essays and so on. And it is studies in social biography of people in the Middle East. And so it's a great resource that we use often for teaching, because it's really about people whose lives are usually not documented, particularly in the past when it was only elites who could have, biographies written about them or have the wherewithal to write autobiographies. So how did you talk about, working class people, peasants, people who were normally not considered the subjects of history? So there were special techniques for how you elucidate their experience and put it into some kind of meaningful context. And he's going to be teaching a course on that. And of course, they have all the other, kinds of things that people want, STEM and so forth, and, some calculus and things that people need if they're going to be doctors or engineers and so on. So it's a worthy cause. I'm going to put the link in the chat. And hope that you will join me in this live stream over the course of, however much time we have. 90 minutes. If we're really into it, maybe we'll go, a little bit longer. We'll see, what the interest level is. But what I want to do here is encourage you to support this project, to help students in Gaza gain internet access that they will need for the online course, data packages and so forth. And also we plan to hire some local Gazan graduate students to run kind of discussion sections and act as TAs for these courses. Obviously I'm far away and I'll be doing it online, so it will be really helpful to have graduate students there to support students who are taking the class. I've put the link in the chat. If you could join me in donating, if there were 10, maybe 5, this is a sort of spontaneous stream, so I don't know how many people will be in it. But if 5 people would join me to make a donation, however small, and modest. It's mostly just to keep momentum and continue progress in the campaign to reach the goal, so that many students as possible in Gaza will be able to benefit. Okay, so that's it for the sort of messages up at the top. I want this to be a real open dialogue and discussion. So I want to take questions, and sometimes when we have a guest or a panel like we do on Iran versus the Epstein Empire series, it can be difficult to work questions from you into discussion because there's always so much to say with like multiple voices and discussants. But in this case, it's me one on one. And I'm going to be looking at the chat. And if you have questions about history, about politics, about religion that I feel I can, discuss and give you a reasonable kind of starting point, if not an answer, at least some analysis, putting things in some kind of context, that's what I would love to do. It is, of course, Good Friday, and so that seems to me an interesting place to start until we get some serious, kind of questions that I can answer. I already see one from Words 8621. Thoughts on how Venezuela oil might impact the global picture. I'm not an oil economist, so I might have some vague thoughts, but the point is that it does seem that the Venezuela gambit by the Trump administration to abduct a sitting, democratically elected leader of a sovereign country, in Nicolas Maduro, as well as his partner, I believe his wife, certainly at least partner, and to capture them, abduct them, kidnap them, and forcibly remove them from their country, take them to the United States to stand trial for ridiculous charges and allegations. This is, of course, an outrageous act, but it was done, I think, not only because, of course, Venezuela poses a challenge and represents a different model with the Bolivarian revolution for social and economic development in Latin America that is outside the, imperialist system. That, of course, that's one reason why it was under this kind of pressure. It had been under sanctions, but I think this kind of particular act was to try and acquire control over, if not like to completely steal the oil resources, at least to control how it enters the market, right? The oil market, and to whom it would be sold, and to have that kind of control over it, as a preparatory step for doing two things. One, of course, putting total pressure on Cuba, which relied upon oil for its energy source from Venezuela on relatively, beneficial terms. So that was one, of course, to kind of really strangle Cuba, the next step, but also perhaps to deny, uh, some of the restriction on the flow of oil that would be an obvious and necessary response by Iran to the planned and, as they call it, imposed war on Iran. So that might have been a step to try and control it, to be able to, offset restriction on oil with Iran's interdicting of hostile shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. So that's all I really can say about that. Others may know a lot more. And, you know, um, I see also that on this question of Venezuela, Kibe Keeps, I believe. Oh, no, it's none underscore remaining says, haven't seen Joe Emmersberger on any streams recently. Might have him come on and talk about his writing on Venezuela sometime soon, certainly. And we had him on in the fall when there were these kind of attacks on so-called drug traffickers, which was really just assassination targeting of civilians with no basis in international law, just pure aggression. And many people were killed in those attacks on these boats in Venezuela, in Venezuelan waters and parts of the Caribbean. So, yeah, we could certainly have Joe back on at some point to talk about it. He has written a book with Justin Potter, of course, on Venezuela. So he's somebody who's very up on that context. So I wanted to start off with something about, the fact that it is Good Friday in at least the Latin or the Western church. And of course, some of you may know that there are different Christian sects and denominations that have, different ways of calculating when Easter is, and in fact, actually in the history of Christianity and Christianity and in the history of the church, calculation over, the method of calculation for determining when Easter fell was a big controversy for people in the church, and even the Latin Western church didn't have complete consensus on this in early centuries of Christianity and even into the Middle Ages, parts of the Middle Ages. So you had, for example, the Irish church had a different way of calculating, and um, they were very serious about trying to maintain their autonomy for what they believed was the right way to determine when Easter was. But there has remained a major difference in these methods of calculation between the Western and the Eastern church. And that's one of the issues that they've had. And so the Orthodox churches, as well as other Eastern churches, have a different method of calculation. So this coming weekend is not Easter, and today is not Good Friday for Greek and Russian and Serbian and Coptic Christians. They will be celebrating Easter and Holy Week next week and next weekend. But Good Friday, as you know, is the day in which Christians kind of commemorate the Passion of Christ. That is the series of events involved, and passion, of course, coming from the word of suffering. So it's the suffering of Christ and the crucifixion in Jerusalem, and the events that then lead to his entombment later after, death on the cross, entombment, and then resurrection on the third day, as it's conventionally characterized. And what that means is Sunday. So the third day, this being the first day, and then Saturday being the second, and that third day begins basically at sunset. So historically speaking, the day began, and this is true also for, say, the Islamic calendar, for the Jewish calendar, is that the day begins on the eve. So, and that is, there in the notion of, say, Christmas Eve, right? The 24th at sunset, then it begins, basically, it is the start of Christmas. And so Christmas Eve is the eve of Christmas, and sunset the next day is basically on the is the end of Christmas, right? In this kind of classical or traditional sort of way in which time was marked or calculated. So Easter, kind of the Easter Sunday, kind of began on what we would think of as Saturday night, right? So it's worth pointing out, like today, these are, of course, very important events in the Christian calendar, and the Latin or Western churches would be and are celebrating Holy Week, and today is Good Friday, and this coming Sunday as Easter. We know, of course, that Easter in Jerusalem is an important festival and object of pilgrimage. So in the past, historically, it wasn't just about kind of making pilgrimage to go visit the sacred place in Palestine, in Jerusalem, and so forth, the Church of the Holy Resurrection, or Church of the Resurrection, as it's known, in which the tomb of Christ, as Christians call it, the Holy Sepulchre, particularly the Latin Christians, the sepulchre of Christ, as well as, of course, nativity scenes, the manger in Bethlehem, and other places that are described in the gospel histories or stories of Jesus, right? So pilgrimage would be going to visit those places and praying in those places, but it wasn't just to go visit them, but it was also to try and be in Jerusalem for the Easter services and the Holy Week services, the days of darkness in Nebra, Thursday after Maundy, Tuesday, then Thursday and Friday in particular, and then Saturday, Holy Saturday, and then Sunday, Easter, right? And now, during the course of the war, the Ramadan War that Israel and the United States launched and started against Iran through their attacks on Iran, they have declared a kind of condition and state urgency that it, for the sake and the excuse that's being given, or the rationale that's being articulated, is that because of security concerns, the Church of the Resurrection and the Holy Sepulchre will not be open for worship, which is truly a monumental decision. It's like very unparalleled through many other wars and times of turmoil and crisis. Historically, these places have remained open for worshipers. This is really pretty unprecedented in modern history, right? Yeah, Maundy Thursday, that's right. But this is, I think, important to remark on, because already, of course, the Al-Aqsa complex, that is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Qubbat al-Sakhra, the Dome of the Rock, were off limits for Muslim worshippers during this holy period of Ramadan. And normally in Ramadan, especially in the last 10 days, worshippers would be involved in special prayers and also seclusion. People would basically stay and worship like all night in the mosque and sort of take up residence for the last 10 days of Ramadan there. And during the whole course of Ramadan, the typical night prayers and other established canonical prayers, that would be performed in congregation, but especially the additional night prayers that are done during Ramadan were impossible to do in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so, on top of the denial of Muslim worshipers access to and freedom of worship in the sacred places that pertain to their worship, now Christians also are being prevented from access to their holy places and performance of their seasonal and very important, like Easter is really the most important holy day in Christianity. And so to be prevented from access to the Holy Sepulchre, where the Church of the Resurrection, this is pretty monumental. This is very serious. Now, I'm raising this not just to say, isn't it awful that these other religious communities are prevented from, fulfilling their religious obligations and celebrating their religious festivals. But in fact, actually, I think there is a real, genuine argument to be made that the legitimacy of Israeli rule in Jerusalem, which is already, of course, a violation of international law. The UN Security Council Resolution 242 declared, that East Jerusalem belonged to Palestinians as capital for their state, and that the occupation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza is illegal under international law. But I think in general, there has also been a pattern where Israeli authorities and the Israeli state tried to legitimize its occupation by declaring or promising after the 1967 war, when it took and occupied these territories, that it would try to adhere to some kind of responsible custodianship over the holy places on behalf of all the religions. And in fact, soon after the occupation, it passed a law called the Protection of Holy Places Law, numbered 5727 in 1967. And I want to just read a little bit about what this law um, articulates and binds the Israeli authorities to do in their quest to try and legitimize, sovereignty over East Jerusalem, at least also to kind of forestall or prevent criticism that their illegal occupation of Jerusalem would be detrimental to the interests and rights of other religious communities, which would be seen as particularly illegitimate in Jerusalem. And I want to remind you that this isn't just a matter of PR, but in fact, actually, that the United Nations had always, in its original plan, as much criticism as I would have about that biased and unfair and unjust plan, but that at least under the original partition plan in 1948, 1947 was when the plan was announced, but to go into effect in 1948, it articulated, firstly, of course, much less territory than Israel ended up seizing in the course of its war and the Nakba, the dispossession of many, of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. So it took more territory than had been allocated under the UN partition plan, but also that Jerusalem itself was meant to be an internationally administered city, because it was believed and felt that as a holy city for the Christians, Muslims, and Jews, it was not to be part of one particular state originally that might, prejudice access to the holy places. And the mechanism that the UN determined would best protect, as wrong as this is, I don't agree with this policy, but it established this principle that responsible government and sovereignty over Jerusalem was tied and connected to fair and equitable custodianship of the religious places of all three religions. Okay, so this is what was passed by the Knesset in 1967. The holy places shall be protected from desecration and any other violation, and from anything likely to violate the freedom of access of the members of the different religions to the places sacred to them, or their feelings with regard to those places. Okay, that continues, but I just want to pause for a moment. Or their feelings with regard to those places. It's kind of an odd phrasing, what that might exactly refer to in legal terms, what they're actually talking about. We can understand freedom of access to the places sacred to them, but not doing anything. And, free from protected, they should be protected from desecration or any other violation, and from anything likely to violate the freedom of access or their feelings with regard to those places. So it's fairly wide ranging and capacious kind of commitment that's being made there. I don't know what people think about, what that feelings with regard to those places might really mean and refer to. But I'll continue with the provision, with the second provision. The second section, 2A. Whosoever desecrates or otherwise violates a holy place shall be liable to imprisonment for a term of 7 years. B. Whosoever does anything likely to violate the freedom of access of the members of the different religions to the places sacred to them, or their feelings with regard to those places, shall be liable to imprisonment for a term of 5 years. So again, it's that kind of phrasing or framing. And so I really am curious. I haven't done enough research. I just looked up this law because I knew that there would and had to be certain provisions put in place as part of trying to dispel criticism that might come of Israel's custodianship as a result of its occupation in East Jerusalem over the sacred places, over the holy places. Okay, 3, this law shall add to and not derogate from any other law. 4, the minister of religious affairs is charged with the implementation of this law, and he may, it's clearly written in 1967, he may, after consultation with or upon the proposal of representatives of the religions concerned, and with the consent of the minister of justice, make regulations as to any matter relating to such implementation. Right. So this is about how to regulate to ensure that the first provision, is substantially protected, that the places are protected, and that freedom of access is granted. And so then these bodies, the Minister of Religious Affairs, with representation by the religions, like communities of these religions, and consent to the Minister of Justice. So, there is a clear principle here that unilateral actions taken in attempting to implement this, aren't particularly legitimate. It needs to be done with consultation with the religions, all the religions themselves that might be affected, right? So that's kind of important, it seems to me, as well. And then lastly, 5, this law shall come into force on the date of its adoption by the Knesset, which was June 27th, 1967. Okay, so what I'm trying to suggest and trying to argue is that this current practice now, which we can see, violates the spirit and the law, really, of commitments undertaken since 1967 and the illegal occupation of Israel. It was seen as really illegitimate if it didn't at least uphold some minimal guarantees of freedom of access to and protection of. Now, we've been hearing, in addition, a variety of threats being made to the holy places, particularly to the Al-Aqsa complex, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and complex, that, and we know that there are efforts and interests among the extreme Messianic wing of Jewish Zionists in Israel to destroy Al-Aqsa and the Qubbat al-Sakhra, the Dome of the Rock, in order to rebuild, as they would say, rebuild. I mean, there's a lot of question marks about what was there before Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. But in any case, to build the so-called Third Temple, right? And there have been allegations made by Iranian authorities that there may be attempts to damage the Muslim holy places in Jerusalem under cover of the Ramadan War, to blame Iranian, missile attacks and so forth for this, and that these would be false flags, and that there's no chance that Iran would be targeting these places, but to use the war potentially to achieve these long-held aims of damaging or destroying the Muslim religious sites in order to prepare for a so-called third temple. So, you know, there was always an expectation that there would be some kind of even-handed administration of the holy places, and it really severely undermines even further Israel's illegitimate occupation of East Jerusalem, that these threats have been made and that there has been suppression of both Muslim and Christian access to their holy places for important religious festivals. Now, I should point out that this isn't, completely new, in the sense that over the last few years there have been increasing restrictions on the number of people, for example, who can attend Easter services at the Church of the Holy Resurrection. Particularly popular is during the miracle of the Holy Fire, and I don't want to talk all about that. It's something I work on and research, and I could go on forever on that. So I don't want to talk about that, but it is a time where many people from different parts of the world, but also parts of Palestine, have historically and traditionally come to attend Easter services and to witness and participate in the receiving of the Holy Fire, okay, miracle in the Church of the Resurrection. So that's like an important part of Christian liturgy, Christian services and devotional piety in Jerusalem. There have been increasing restrictions on the numbers and access, and there have been complaints made by the Greek Patriarchate precisely on this point. And in fact, actually, one of the few things we've seen the Palestinian Authority actually speak up about has been actually issuing a communique over the last couple of years previous to this coming Easter, of criticism for the way in which Israeli authorities and police and municipal authorities and police have prevented access and attendance. And of course, you should have followed that there were invasions of Al-Aqsa in previous Ramadans, last year, the previous year, that involved defiling and desecrating the Al-Aqsa Mosque with tear gas, rubber bullets, attacks and invasion on worshipers there who were expelled from the mosque, brutally beaten. And so there have been a variety of acts that have led up to this current situation where all religious services and all access has been eliminated. So I think this is very much related to the question of sovereignty and religious sovereignty, and it is one more thing that undermines kind of Israel's claims to sovereignty. Is it, that if it cannot adhere to the pattern, and it's a long-standing, age-old pattern and tradition of guaranteeing access that happened to some extent under the British during the Mandate period, that they continued what were called the Ottoman regulations and the Ottoman traditions for managing the holy places in Jerusalem and the access of different religious communities. Under this, and this needs more research by me to find out in the late Ottoman period how, what were the conventions and regulations for Ottoman management of Jerusalem and the holy places. But one thing we do know that has persisted to the present day is that in order for the different Christian denominations to have a kind of peaceful, organized access to their church and to organize the, administration of who can perform their religious services at what time, that they actually chose in order to help kind of manage these things, they chose two Palestinian Muslim families to be keepers in some way of one, the key to the door to the Church of the Resurrection. And so this Palestinian Muslim kind of family has the guardianship over the key to the Church of the Resurrection, and every day, is responsible for opening up the church at the correct time. and another for opening the doors. Okay, so one keeps the key, and another family opens the doors at the appointed time and are regarded as kind of keepers of the access to um, the Holy Sepulchre. And according to tradition, it's probably fairly legendary. This was a task that was appointed to these two families in 1187. After the recapture of Jerusalem by Salahuddin Ayyubi in the era of the Crusades. Immediately preceding the Third Crusade. In fact, that was the reason for essentially the reasons for the Third Crusade was the loss in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin, devastation of the armies of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, and capture of the so-called, very important relic of the True Cross. A few months later, Jerusalem itself was captured after a siege, and access to the holy places was guaranteed for all religions. Okay, that included the Latin Christians who had been excluding everyone else from access to the holy places of Jerusalem when it was under Crusader control for the previous, close to 100 years, about 90, years. This access was restored, and there's the tradition that Salahuddin appointed these two families to keep the key and open the door for the Church of the Resurrection. Now, I don't know if that, in fact, it goes all the way back to that period of the late 12th century, but it certainly was an Ottoman tradition when the Ottomans became the kind of rulers over Jerusalem as a result of Sultan Selim I's conquests in the Levant, right, in the early 16th century. So it's thought that at some point after that, the Ottomans arrived on some kind of model to continue the tradition of making sure access for all the religions to their holy places would be guaranteed, and that those places would be protected. And of course, endowments were established or continued in order, to preserve the buildings and for the upkeep and so on. And so that's like the history of that tradition of a multi-faith, multi-religious tradition under Islamicate kind of governance, under the governance of various earlier Muslim rulers and dynasties over centuries, of a principle of toleration and access and protection for all the holy places for the particular religions. So for this to be abrogated at this moment is a very serious kind of change, it seems to me. Okay, that's something just to say on, here on Good Friday, to mark this day and to, remember that the Palestinian Christians have been prevented for a long time from being able to attend Easter services as a result of the occupation and its worsening and the building of the wall, the apartheid wall. So this has been a problem of access, in the regime that actually grew worse as a result of Oslo for Palestinian movement and access to Jerusalem. It's especially during this time when the Holy Fire, people would go to Jerusalem for Easter services, and then when the Holy Fire in particular, which will happen next weekend, not this coming weekend, but the following weekend, to then bring the Holy Fire back and light the candles and lamps in their local churches all across Palestine. They have been prevented from doing that for many, many years as a result of the 1967 occupation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So that's something just now that my thoughts, my prayers, and my mind, is with Palestinian Christians who are now being prevented, even if they're already in Jerusalem, from worshiping at their most holy site, the Church of the Resurrection and the Holy Sepulchre. Okay. All right. Well, so that's that issue, but I want to see, what else people are interested, in discussing and talking about. Michael_Julian points out, Orthodox Easter 2026 falls on April 12th, just as I've been saying. It's the following week. The main Russia midnight mass in Moscow at Cathedral of Christ the Savior, led by Patriarch Kirill, is always beautiful. Watch live. So yes, in fact, actually in the past, services in Jerusalem would be live streamed, and in particular, the liturgical performances awaiting the arrival of the miracle of the Holy Fire would be live streamed as well. And since I'm studying that miracle and its long history, I watch those live streams. So it's quite a sight. Okay, yes, people have been asking for the link. I've put it in a couple of times. I'm posting it once more. This is the link for the Spocks for Gaza fundraiser, so that you can help sponsor students in Gaza to take my course and other courses online, so that this summer, so that they can continue their education. Please be generous and donate to this if you can. It was at $8,990 at the start of the live stream, and it is now at $9,130. And perhaps some of the donators are, online. Fine. I do see some, names of people who are commonly in the chat here and who are listeners and watchers of the program. So we thank you so much for your generosity. I see a colleague and friend, and Glegg and Gabriel Rockhill gave a couple of days ago. Lydia Cruddy, who's on this, has been in the live stream chat in the past, and that there are some other people who more recently have been giving. It would be wonderful if we could boost this, up a little bit further. I'll be making a donation at some point, probably at the conclusion, and I hope a few of you will join me. I really appreciate it, to let these students continue their education. And my course, as I said, will be called Guerrilla History, Anti-Colonial Resistance, History Theory, Practice, and something, of relevance to them, since they have been living through and are continuing in an anti-colonial struggle for liberation. Okay, so what else? We have Moon clearly holds a deep, this is from Haile Sela. Adnan, moon clearly holds a deep meaning in Islam. Yes, the moon is a, kind of figures prominently. In fact, actually, there are, well, I won't go too much into that, but let's see what the rest of the question is. And not just for marking time, I think, with a very limited knowledge of the traditions, what is its name in Arabic? Well, the basic name for the moon is Al-Qamar, okay? But there are many different names, just as there is in English for the moon, the crescent moon, the full moon. They have different words in Arabic. So instead of it just being moon and then it's being described, with a modifier, full, crescent, etc., there are different words in Arabic for phases of the moon. So the crescent moon, that indicates the new month, right, the birth of a new moon and the beginning of a new month in Islamic calendar, is called the hilal. So sighting the hilal to mark the beginning of the end of the previous month and the beginning of a new month is done by sighting the hilal. That is the very slender crescent moon that rises, very low above the horizon and is also very faint and thin, so it can be very difficult to see. So sighting the moon is how they determined when the next month began. And of course, the full moon is the Badr. So the mid-month, on the 14th of the lunar month, 14th, 15th, is the full moon, and that is known as the Badr. And yes, the moon does have a lot of significance, and it's talked about in different places in the Quran. So let's see, what else do we have? And please feel free to put questions about like contemporary events, what's been going on. I mean, there's a lot of new developments, and I could just begin, discussing some of them, in the Ramadan War, in what's been happening with Iran. We are, of course, on the cusp of expecting a possible, form of some form of a ground assault attack. At least this is what a lot of watchers of military affairs have been saying. We had, of course, a message after Trump's speech a couple nights ago, where he declared, that almost all the aims had been achieved and how much they had destroyed, etc. And that was a kind of important and interesting speech to interpret for insight into what these plans may be. And in fact, I had a recording with for Guerrilla History with Nina and Naveed Farnia, and of course my co-host Henry Hakamaki. And Nina made an interesting point, which I tweeted about, which was that she felt that despite all the braggadocio and boastful exaggeration about achieving all of these war aims, that in fact, actually, Trump was preparing the groundwork and preparing, politically speaking, for Americans to get used to the idea that this would be a longer war. And that is absolutely counter to a lot of the obvious rhetoric of the speech, and to how most people have interpreted it. And so I asked her, what was it in particular that gave her the feeling that Trump was trying to politically prepare the American public for a longer conflict. And she pointed out that he went through what was kind of a strange listing of the length and duration of previous wars, World War II, the Korea, the conflict on the Korean Peninsula, the war, on Vietnam, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War in the 2000s. He didn't mention Afghanistan, interestingly. And then mentioned that this, at the time of his speech, had only gone on for, what was it, like 36 days. And she read into that, because we know Trump is no historian. Okay, so this excessive details about the length. Why was he going through them? Of course, one way of looking at it was to say, look how much I've accomplished in just 36 days. But even he was admitting that not all the aims had been accomplished. All the war aims had not been accomplished quite yet, and that there might be a couple of weeks or so. But he was essentially inculcating and expressing the idea that this was a very short time for an American military conflict, and that there was a lot more time before it ever, before it would become considered a long war, right? By telling Americans how long some of the previous conflicts had been, it was, in a way, according to her analysis, preparing the public for this lasting a long time. And that fit their analysis that Iran had successfully kind of turned the war into a war of attrition, but that now the United States was preparing for a war of attrition, potentially. So we will see, of course, in due course. Since that time, also, almost as a response and a rejoinder, we had President of Iran, Mahmoud Pezeshkian, delivering a message to the American people, which was a very kind of interesting. Not only was the letter interesting in what it covered and what it argued, but it also the idea of trying to short circuit the political, diplomatic mechanisms for communication, to speak directly, as it were, to the American people. I mean, I don't think it was covered by very many mainstream media outlets, so I'm not sure how many Americans actually came across President Pezeshkian's address to them. But that was an interesting technique. And I would say on many levels, we've been seeing, why it is Iran does, somebody like me would remark that Iran has a very long history of statecraft and diplomacy, as a long, enduring political a polity. Certainly, it's ancient empires, but in the more recent period, um, even when it was ruled by Turkic tribal dynastic conquerors and governors, the people who ran the empire or who ran the state tended to be, Persian bureaucrats, secretaries, record keepers, chancery officials, administrators, viziers, the ministers of state. And so they certainly have a long and continuous tradition of statecraft in that fashion. So that was also interesting and perhaps worth a closer look if we wanted to take a look at that. So there's a lot to talk about in that context, plus, of course, what's been happening in Lebanon. There's some interesting developments in Syria, which I have myself difficulty really figuring out, credible information and trying to interpret and contextualize what I'm seeing, which looks like Syrian National Army that had sort of melted away and disappeared in the kind of takeover of the country by HTS in December 2024. Perhaps returning to public into the public sphere, and marching. We've seen videos of people who are characterized as members of the Syrian National Army that had, been constituted as the army under the Assad government and the Syrian state. Demonstrating against this new law that would classify punishment for those convicted of crimes, i.e., resistance against settler colonial occupation and war. Basically Palestinian prisoners would uniquely be subject to the death penalty and be executed. And this, of course, has outraged many people globally, but it seems to have also activated a serious response, in this case, among Syrian army that has, if not reconstituted itself, at least come out publicly in certain force in places like Aleppo, which is where the video I saw was taking place, in Halab, chanting, that they are brothers with Gaza and that they will, avenge Gaza and free Gaza, and protesting this new Israeli legal punishment, that they're putting in place for Palestinian political prisoners. So that's another kind of interesting thing. I will be talking with Laith Marouf on a live stream, and I'll be setting up the live stream soon with Laith Marouf on Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern, to talk particularly about the Lebanon front and Syria, since he is an expert, and of course update if there is a ground invasion or any other ground assault and new developments over this weekend, as is being anticipated. We will talk about them 10 a.m. Eastern time on Monday. So look forward to that. Okay, so what else is going on here? Let's take a look in the chat and see if there are any questions that have come in. And while I'm doing that, I do want to remind you to support the Spox for Gaza fundraiser for students to gain internet access and to hire TAs to support courses through that platform so that they can continue with their education. And I will try again, of course, to put that into the chat. If a few people could also donate, that would be great. Okay, Haile Sela with another question. Could you recommend a translation of the Quran for someone who never read it? Okay, interesting question. There are so many, just like the Bible and some other holy books that have been translated multiple times. There are so many different translations that it can be difficult to figure out like what would be a good one, a reliable one. There have been translations made of the Quran since the 12th century. I myself have studied the first translation into a Western language and the first comprehensive full translation as a separate text of the Quran. There are, which is the translation into Latin by Robert of Ketton, who was hired basically to do this by the abbot of Cluny, Peter the Venerable, in the early 1140s. It's thought 1142. And there have been since that time many Western translations, other Latin translations, and then into the vernacular languages, that is the common spoken languages that come to prominence in the early modern period, that there were translations into Italian. Of course, there were translations into Spanish. One of them is another one that I've studied by Juan Andres, who also wrote a polemic called Confutatio al-Qurani. He converted to Christianity under the reign of Ferdinand and Isabel, who had conquered, of course, the entire peninsula, including the last sovereign Muslim state on the peninsula, the Emirate of Granada. And he seems to have been a scholar, a religious scholar, Muslim faqih, an alim, a trained scholar, a jurist, and he converted and not only made a translation of the Quran into Spanish, but also wrote, as I said, a kind of polemic against his former religion and co-religionists. But it was also translated into English. I forget the year, if it was 17. It was in the later part of the 18th century by George Sale, or Saleh. I just like, there's often a little A. I don't know how his name was pronounced, but George Sale. That was a very interesting translation because it included a lot of additional discussion and apparatus. And so there's this long history. Which Quran should one get if you're an English reader, for example? Well, I will tell you that while there are a number of good translations, in fact, the one by Abdul Halim, Muhammad Abdul Halim, that is published by Oxford, is considered a very good one. Parts of the Quran that have been translated by Thomas Cleary, very beautiful translation. What I would recommend as a reference work, and it's not that I always think the translation is the best. Okay, I'll tell you another one that you should get is Muhammad Asad's The Message of the Quran. And that's interesting because he's acknowledging that it can't be kind of translated in terms of the sense of reproducing the text. What you can is try and convey the message in a different language. There is a kind of sense within Muslim theological and kind of in theological discourse and interpretation of the Quran that the Quran is an Arabic text. Like, uniquely, it has to be in Arabic, and it is recited in Arabic in all the prayers, even if you speak other vernacular languages commonly, whether Urdu, English, Turkish, Persian, etc. It is recited for liturgical and prayer purposes in Arabic. And that's because there is an investment in the language of the Quran as being uniquely Arabic. And the Quran itself tells us several times, Hada Quranun Arabiyyun Mubin. This is a clear Arabic Quran. So some people felt that translation itself was not really rendering the Quran in a different language, because that itself was somehow impossible. It was a different text, but that you could be conveying the meaning in some sense, right? So that's kind of conveyed by the kind of title of the translation, The Message of the Quran by Muhammad Asad. But I think I have at hand somewhere around here, yes, right here, a translation that it's more than just because it's a reasonably good translation. I mean, there's some times where I think maybe there are other better ways of phrasing a particular verse, etc. But what's good about this translation of the Quran is that it comes with extensive commentary that reproduces some of the ways in which Muslim commentators have understood the verses. And that's actually very interesting and helpful. So it's like the study Bible. Okay, so the Bible, there are many translations of the Bible into all these different languages and so on. The King James Bible, and then revisions of that, as well as other ones. And there's the Catholic tradition of English translation, the Douay a translation of the Bible that Catholics prefer, and I think maybe endorsed by the church. So there are many different ones, but for somebody who wants to read and understand the Bible and have a sense of how others interpreted and understood its verses traditionally, and the different debates that there might be about interpretation of various verses and so forth, there is the study Bible, right, that does basically that. Well, so there's the study Quran, which I think is a really excellent resource. And it's by a team of translators under the editorship of Sayyid Hussein Nasser. And you can see that if you take a look, for example, here, that there's translation up at the top in the larger type of the verses. And then here, there's all this commentary on the verses that reproduces, the main classical and even modern genre of what's called tafsir al-Quran, or interpretation of the Quran. And it's a whole subdiscipline of the Muslim religious sciences to use linguistic and lexicographical, as well as other extra scriptural resources to interpret the verses. And the best, of course, principle that developed in this tradition of tafsir al-Quran, or explanation of the Quran, interpretation, i.e. hermeneutics of the Quran, is to use the Quran to interpret the Quran. So your most authoritative way of explaining a verse is if there's another verse that clarifies what the possible meaning of that verse is. And so there's a whole tradition, and this collection is a monument of scholarship, or this translation is a monument of scholarship, because it kind of brings together that 1400, it's a little bit less than that for the formal genre of works in this vein, but say like 1300 years of interpretation of the Quran by Muslims, is kind of condensed in a form here that's readily accessible, where you can get a better idea or understanding of how Muslims understood the meaning of the verses, and the different debates that people had, and the different interpretations that people had over them. So that's what I would suggest as a great resource. I've heard there's some Jordanian guardianship of Al-Aqsa Mosque. Could you talk about that, please? From Red Kitty. Yeah, sure. I mean, before the 1967 war and occupation of East Jerusalem, the holy places were under the guardianship of the King of Jordan, the Hussein family, Malik Hussein, and so on, because it was held by Jordan. Like the West Bank was under Jordanian control, even if so they still have maintained some kind of claim over East Jerusalem, because they historically, after the British Mandate and after 1948, had control of the holy places until 1967. So that's the basis for their guardianship, and interest in it. Okay, well, Ode to John Trudell wanted me to elaborate further on the moon's importance. So clearly we're going back a ways in the chat. My apologies. Things may have moved on, and I don't know if I have that much more right now to say about it, but I'll think about it. And if something comes up and it's worth kind of coming back to that question, I would happily do so. There's a lot of sun in my eye right now. I'm going to do something about that. It's this time of day now that the day is changing. I'm going to put some kind of cover. I'll be right back in just one moment as I try to cover. Okay, I don't know if that helped. It may not. We'll see. Tried to put some. No, it didn't help. It really didn't help. So we've got a nearly insoluble kind of problem. I need better window coverings. That's probably not great either. We'll just probably have to live with it, and me with the sun in my face. Okay, well, what can we do? All right, well, let's see what else. Okay, yes, I'm glad that you mentioned this none_remaining. Did you see M. Javad Zarif's article, How Iran Should End the War in Foreign Affairs? Been looking into Zarif since that popped up. Certainly interested in more context for his political background. Okay, he was former foreign minister, and he is, I believe it was under him that the JCPOA was negotiated, right? I think it's a I'm not the total expert on like contemporary divisions within the Islamic Republic of Iran politically, the political factions, but of course, you understand, broadly speaking, that there are kind of reformists, those who, well, we'll get into who they are, reformists, and others who are committed to a more populist and conservative kind of understanding of the Constitution. Oh, great. The Constitution of the Islamic Republic, and adhere to, a more militant, perhaps, kind of approach, or an anti-Western approach, in the sense that they would rather continue to develop relationships with other global South countries, and particular with China, rather than framing the future of Iran entirely through the relationship with the United States and the West in general, in seeking negotiations, over Iran's nuclear program in order to lift sanctions, right? So what had happened is, and you could go back, and in fact, actually, I would recommend the discussion that I had with Ali Alizadeh on this channel. He has a wonderful program, Jadal TV, and he sometimes, and it's mostly Farsi language discussion, but he does do some English language programming on Jadal English, and he has been a guest on this show once, and I would love to actually have him back on again. I should look into that. I was thinking about it just the other day, or earlier today even, that I should try and invite Alizadeh on. But in the episode I had with him, the discussion, he went into great detail, the reformist camp and faction that has been elected several times over the last couple of decades, for example, maybe even the last 2.5, 3 decades, since Khatami, since the presidency of Khatami. And the reformists really felt that negotiations, which had ceased for a long period of time, since there were not diplomatic relations between Iran and the United States, that negotiations were what they ran on, that would be a solution to Iran's problems and its isolation in the world, the sanctions, and so forth, and that the resistance to negotiations, under, say, Ahmadinejad, who was elected and is a more populist figure after Khatami, for example, and who was an ally of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, that they resisted negotiations and didn't feel that they would be fruitful. In fact, that they might be even a trap, and that they didn't conceptualize Iran's progress and future entirely through the framework of whether they could repair their relationship with the United States, which is what the reformists constantly, offered, was the idea that if we could just kind of get negotiating and conclude an agreement with the United States, then we would have the lifting of sanctions. We'd be integrated into the world. We could do business and be connected and be a normal country in the kind of, among the nations of the world. We'd be a normal country, meaning that we had positive relations with the West that had undertaken these unilateral, punitive, isolating economic sanctions and diplomatic and political sanctions on Iran. So Zarif was one of those, was in that camp and in the government in which, he served as foreign minister. It had come into the elections on a platform and a mandate to restore negotiations with the United States. And so they did, and they concluded the JCPOA, which was then never fully implemented even under Obama, was of course torn up and repudiated under Trump. And despite running on the explicit promise that he would restore the JCPOA agreement, Biden never did. And so we are where we are now. And Zarif has the reputation of having led Iran down the path, the primrose path of negotiations with the United States, only to have been betrayed, and for it to have been a strategic error and mistake. And so it's interesting that he has the courage at this moment, after basically this attack on Iran, this imperialist war on Iran, has essentially invalidated the entire theory of his kind of political orientation. And as we said on a previous Iran versus the Epstein Empire, that the war has reformed the reformists like Araghchi, Pezeshkian. These are all also people who are elected under a reform kind of mandate, maybe not quite as naive and extreme, you might say, in terms of its overtures to the West, as the Zarif kind of administration, the administration in which Zarif was foreign minister. But this is quite interesting. And it seems to coordinate rather well with the advice and analysis that Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute for what I would call soft imperial statecraft, they call it responsible statecraft, had been saying fairly recently on some programs on the kind of liberal left that he's appeared on, where he had analyzed the situation from the perspective of that it wasn't only the danger that Trump might not be able to find an off-ramp or an exit ramp where he could declare victory and still, get out of the war, but in fact, actually, that there was a fairly narrow window for that to be possible, and that it was really also the responsibility, and that there was a danger because the current Iranian leadership might be too ambitious and aggressive in its prosecuting of the war and rejection of ceasefire and diplomacy and negotiations, that it would miss the chance in its overambition where there could be a mutually agreed upon and negotiated end to the war that would be some kind of compromise, that both sides would, end up making, but each could feel that they'd gotten enough out of it. And so this article in Foreign Affairs really represents perhaps that same logic or thinking that Trita Parsi had been articulating. And that's why, it's very interesting that it's being, promoted right now. I guess my question would be, why are you publishing it in Foreign Affairs? Who is your audience? If this is advice that you have for Iran and Iranians and Iranian leadership, are there not other venues in which you could articulate this perspective or advice? Or is it that you are so kind of regarded in this moment and in this atmosphere, regarded as so beyond the political mainstream of what's reasonable and what is which he even acknowledges that night after night there are people demanding in the streets. And of course, we don't know what proportion of the population the hundreds of thousands and millions of people who come out every night represent, but it's clearly a substantial portion of Iranian society and of the Iranian population that are demanding no negotiations, no compromise, and the achievement of their, war aims, right? So he even knows that this is not necessarily a terribly popular position, or at least that there is widespread support for continuing the war until the war aims are achieved, rather than falling into this continuous pattern of threat and sanction and then attack, and the cycle, repeating itself. So it's quite interesting if his audience for this, advice is in Iran and in the Iranian leadership. Why is he publishing it in Foreign Affairs in English? In the organ, like who publishes Foreign Affairs? That's the Council on Foreign Relations. I mean, this is the utter establishment of the US empire. To my mind, this is really a suspicious act. And in fact, actually, Ali Alizadeh tweeted about this, and I should pull up perhaps his tweet, because he had some interesting remarks. In fact, he's hosting something in Farsi right now, so I'm sure he's talking about it, because this is big news. And what he had to say about it, was that that he thought that what it would mean, in fact, actually, was providing encouragement for the Trump administration to see weaknesses and variance in the Islamic Republic of Iran's leadership, to encourage a round of assassination attacks against top military and political leadership, that they would be seeking to do that because of the idea that there would be alternate leadership potentially available. Of course, we recall and remember that Trump has been saying that he's negotiating with people inside Iran that are the right people, as he put it, because they're being reasonable, and in other words, giving him the concessions that he wants. And it's mysterious who this is, since the actual Iranian leadership, has indicated that they are not engaging in negotiations. There may be messages sent to them, but they are not participating in direct or indirect actual consideration, dialogue, and discussion. Now, that might, be starting to happen. I don't know. But behind the scenes, through intermediaries and so forth. But this kind of confident proclamation that, he has identified and been in touch with and contact with a subterranean alternate, government that's waiting to appear, is quite, mysterious, if not totally absurd and fantastical. But it does suggest that a publication like this by former government officials from previous administrations in the U.S. based Foreign Affairs Foreign Affairs Journal, that is the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, which means it's going to have a wide and immediate audience in the political and security and military establishment of the US and the West in general, is obviously going to encourage the idea that there are factions of potential leadership that are calling for some kind of end to the war now, to avoid a longer war of attrition. And so this is what Ali Alizadeh, said. In fact, actually, I think it was in Jeddah, rather than his personal Jadal TV, rather than in his personal Twitter. So he pointed out here, yeah, okay, so he wrote this in Farsi. So I'm just going to read the kind of X translation. I think it's pretty good because it's fairly straightforward. He said, in the coming days, expect bunker busting bombs in various parts of Iran as America will multiply its efforts to assassinate Sayyid Mujtaba Khamenei. Likewise, expect heavy assassinations of military and political officials. The article by Javad Zarif and Hassan Rouhani, who was the president at the time that Zarif was foreign minister, although I looked at the article in Foreign Affairs, and it was, I believe, just written by authored, the authorship attribution was just to Javad Zarif. But perhaps there's also an additional article, perhaps in Al Jazeera, that Hassan Rouhani also put his name to. But he says the article by Javad Zarif and Hassan Rouhani gave Trump the official signal to prepare for an internal coup. Now, I think that's pretty dramatic kind of allegation, to say, I mean, that's pretty serious. To allege that. I'm going to put it up right here so you can see, and you should definitely follow Ali Alizadeh and his work on both, um, his personal X account and the one for Jidal TV. This was published on Jidal TV. So, yes, I did see that, and I read the article, and while it does say that, a lot of reasonable things about the context, um, of how there may be many reasons for leadership in Iran not to trust the United States and be willing to engage in negotiations until it feels that the conditions are actually correct, right on material basis, that it can end the war in a manner that achieves its aims, that nonetheless they should, for the sake of avoiding excessive civilian death and civilian infrastructural attack and damage. And he's really putting the onus and the responsibility on Iran, and Iran, which did not, as he acknowledges, of course, start this war, but he's putting the burden in some ways that Iran has to be the grown up and figure out a way to end this war, because, of course, the West can't figure out how to do that, right? And so this is a kind of defeatist sort of perspective and approach. I can understand that, it's terrible. I mean, this war is awful. It should never have started. It must be stopped, but it shouldn't necessarily be up to Iran to try and capitulate and compromise. If it doesn't feel, because as he himself notes, they are winning the war right now. They are still continuing to win the war. So the argument and the rationale for why Iran should make lots of compromises in order to provide an appearance, declare victory and end the war in such a way that it would still allow, Trump to kind of claim certain victories and so on. It's kind of incoherent, because it also says it should end the war in a way that, reflects, its goals and advantages. Well, obviously it will do so when it feels, but why is this call being made now at this moment when it is obviously not, the condition that the leadership thinks has been achieved? So, and why would it be published in Foreign Affairs? Like, this message is going, to the West in English. This is not a discussion within Iranian political circles of advice from a serious foreign policy figure. This is, basically, this is basically, telling the West, there are many of us who are important political, and foreign affairs figures in Iran that are ready to kind of try and make a deal, right? So that's, here's the article. And so he's currently, while out of office, been teaching in the Global Studies program at the University of Tehran. And indeed, he says, the views expressed here are his own. I would say they are maybe only his own and a handful of really inveterate reformists, who have not been reformed by the war like so many others of the reformists. So I think this is worth reading to really understand and recognize what kind of an act this is in this context and for what audience. I think that's the way to really understand it. And I think it is, according to Alizadeh, going to lead to some potentially dire consequences of emboldening Trump administration, U.S.-Israeli renewed attacks on, leadership, which, in some ways they probably would do if having the opportunity. But he was talking about much more widespread and devastating attacks using all these bunker busters and so forth. So I would say people should go read this, and this is worth like a longer, discussion. I think it's an interesting piece to analyze. Okay, Ibn Khaldun. Well, we won't talk about that. We still have a long way to go. Another conference that we're organizing on Ibn Khaldun, but I'll probably talk about him a little bit further in the future. And hopefully, there will be a volume that will come out, which will include me writing an introduction and a contribution, as well as many other scholars talking about how Ibn Khaldun's ideas, this historian and social thinker from the late 14th and early 15th centuries in, Islamicate North Africa, who wrote a universal chronicle, and even more influentially, wrote an introductory section that was a methodological meditation, where he developed what he himself thought was a pretty unique form of turning the study of history, the subject of which is to understand human civilization and society, into a science, right? Into a form of knowledge where there would be principles and more universal rules that governed or could be understood for how society worked, right? So he's often credited with inventing the social sciences in some way, because if you look at the organization of knowledge into the various branches, according to Aristotle, history and the study of history and human society was not a science. It didn't have universal norms, laws, and rules that structured it, that could be adduced from the particulars to universals, but rather it was entirely particularistic. And Ibn Khaldun differed and thought that, in fact, actually he had discovered a way of studying, history and human society. History and human society from a kind of scientific perspective, or from a philosophical perspective, i.e., to understand the theory behind historical change and how human society works. So, something I'm continuing on. It's not imminent, but there will be updates about that. Okay. We've been going now 90 minutes, so I don't know how much longer people have an appetite for. I'm happy to try and go through more of the kind of comments and questions to see and identify if there might be some topics that are worth taking up and discussing in this context. I see a lot of wonderful kind of repeat offenders, as it were, in the chat. Zerubbabel, Patmos Revelator, Ode to John Trudell, of course. Okay. I think getting back to the point about where these Syrian troops kind of came from, are these troops which disappeared into Iraq, then no one said a word about. Yeah, it's possible that they were, kind of crossed the border into parts of Iraq, but also there are certain mountainous regions in, between, sort of Syria and Lebanon. There are, the mountains, and I remember early on there were some groups that had taken shelter there, kind of in those mountainous regions. So it'll be very interesting to see, and I'm definitely going to be asking Laith Maruf about how to understand what's happening in Syria and the possibilities for change as well. Okay. Yes, about the course that I'm raising funds for, the Spocks for Gaza program, that I'll be offering this course in guerrilla history, anti-colonial resistance, history theory practice. I will actually figure out a way to adapt that course once I've developed it for the students in Gaza, to try and do some kind of a version for this community broadly. But my first priority is to make sure to organize it in such a way that we can deliver it for students in Gaza. But, once I work on it, I think it could be the basis for a really great online course, for others. So I will certainly be posting more about it when I get closer to developing it. But the first task right now is that we need to raise funds to make sure that we can mount it. So I'm going to put, again, in the chat the link to ask you to join me in supporting this cause so that students can get internet access, and we can hire some TAs to support the course and make it a successful educational experience for students in Gaza who have suffered, the worst things that you could possibly suffer, but who still want to continue their education. Let's see what we can do to help them. So please do be generous. Okay, what do I have? October Comrade says, what do you have to say to the claim that Iran cannot be truly anti imperialist without socialist leadership? That they may be helping China stabilize international imperialism instead of disrupt it. Well, I think October Comrade, I would suggest going back to listen to our last Iran versus the Epstein Empire episode from earlier this week on Monday, where we had Dr. Bikram Gill on, and we had some questions about China come up. And he did a wonderful job of discussing the place of China in the current world system and the ways in which it was contributing to moving away from imperialism. And I don't think that the argument he would make would at all agree with the idea that China was stabilizing international imperialism, but rather was building the infrastructure and the foundations for developing away from it, and that development was accelerating as a result of Iran's confrontation and resistance to the empire in direct war, not because they started the war, but because in defending their sovereignty and in preparing, as they have very expertly, very strategically, and very forensically, we might say, about how the U.S.-Israeli empire operates within and expresses itself in West Asia, particularly through the military bases and their relationship to the host countries and societies, the GCC countries that not only host the host bases, but also are a place that, where capital is recirculated through the petrodollar that buttresses and underpins the entire financial architecture, particularly of the US financial system, the tech industry investments in AI and building of data centers where they can have access to very cheap energy because it is a horrifically, expensive and wasteful kind of use of computing resources in many ways that requires so much energy that was thought that one advantage would be to place these data centers close to the petroleum producing Gulf. uh, the financial links and connections and institutions that have also been targeted, along with all of those tech companies and so forth. That And then finally, also, of course, talking about the way in which they have selectively, the way in which they have exercised a kind of sovereign control over the Strait of Hormuz to encourage payment in yuan rather than dollar to help break the grip of the petrodollar, as well as, of course, controlling flow of goods, in particular energy resources, petroleum, that is needed not just as an energy, producing substance, but also for all the byproducts of plastics, fertilizer. Basically, the infrastructure of the modern economy is built upon petroleum, not just as an energy source that replaced other forms of energy, whether coal or wood and for steam engines, etc. But this kind of change to generating electricity through fossil fuels, but also for all of the byproducts that are so important for everything that is being made in the petrochemical industry. So, in targeting these things, they have actually advanced not just a kind of project of defending national sovereignty and decolonizing West Asia, but we could argue, and it's something that we have certainly argued and discussed on the other editions of this program, but particularly the Iran versus the Epstein Empire series. And that was, I think, episode 9, where Bikram joined us. is that Iran is going beyond just the national sovereignty defense and decolonizing of West Asia in the obvious kind of way of removing U.S. military bases, uh, and they're having to be relocated further away and outside the region increasingly, but also attacking the very integuments of imperialism and how it expresses and articulates itself in control in West Asia. So that is a potentially really world historical kind of change that could be happening, and it is accelerating that process through this war. So the question about whether it can be truly anti-imperialist, well, it depends on what empire you are confronting and its nature. It seems to me Iran is certainly confronting imperialism. We've just noted, however, that of course it is not a univocal, you know, um, kind of structure. There are neoliberals, in the Iranian governing class, and they are known principally as the reformists, and they have been the ones who have undermined Iran's turn to more populist, socialistic kind of programs because they have accepted some of the principles and dictates and orthodoxies of neoliberalism in their Western orientation, in their West toxification, I would argue, their own Gharbzadegi, that they still think that they have to adhere to the US imperial or Western imperial and international system for Iran to have its place in the world, to succeed and to flourish. And that, I think, is what is at stake and what is at issue even within the Iranian political and governing class, that they've had these disputes. And Iran, under extreme sanctions, has of course been subject to corruption. This is what happens with the black market. Those who are closely connected to the government then gain access to be able to bring goods that are under sanction in the black market, to charge excessive prices for them and to enrich themselves and to evade sanctions. But not for the many. The people who suffer are usually the popular working classes, and not the elites and those who have access to government, contracts and government support and so on, to be able to import goods and so on. So that has been a problem and a tension in Iran. But what we are seeing over the course of this Ramadan war and the response is that Iranian society, and particularly its working class, is making very popular socialist demands that go back to the mandate that brought forth the revolution in 1978 and 79, and in the initial years immediately after, that had much more of a kind of socialistic character. Now, if you think socialism is only secular, Western oriented ideological kind of principles, then I think that's a huge mistake, and really ignores all of the contributions that Global South comrades have been struggling for, and the contributions they've been making, where you can have different kinds of forms of socialism. And I think what we're seeing in Iran is in some ways the re-energizing and rebirth of a revolutionary Islamic socialism. But we'll see, revolutions. We know there were, setbacks in the revolution itself, that some of these popular, more egalitarian demands ended up being, overturned. The neoliberals also came into power. There are a lot of potential pitfalls, in this. But right now, at this moment, I see a genuinely anti-imperialist fight with a population that is increasingly united around the revolutionary goals and populist mandate of achieving their war aims. And that egalitarian force is something that's important to be reckoned with. And I would encourage everyone to go and listen to the excellent interview that I had because of Helia Dutari's insights and remarks, an anti-imperialist legal scholar who is a postdoctoral fellow at Tehran University inside Iran, there now doing reporting and analysis and writing. It was wonderful to be able to have her on the program. You can find that on this channel as a video. I think anyone would really benefit, especially our comrades and socialists in the West would really benefit from listening to her insight, her analysis, and her experience of what's happening in Iran. And I think once you do, you would have no doubt that indeed this is a truly anti-imperialist, fight that is taking place. Okay, I hope I, kind of answered that a bit in some ways that will be useful for all of us and comrades. I think there have been a lot of comments, and that was like from way far back. How did Islamic jurisprudence as a study unto itself begin? Well, that's a really long story. I don't know if can go into all of it here. This is from at Etudio. Um, I am going to be developing an online course on the making of the Muslim Middle East, my lecture survey course introducing people to the history of the pre-Islamic Near East, the emergence of Islam, and its first few centuries in which it transformed into a majoritarian over a slow process of hundreds of years into majority Muslim societies, and the development of Islam as a world religion and in a cosmopolitan society, in cosmopolitan societies, up until basically the emergence of the Ottoman Empire in the early modern world. So it's a survey of basically 550 CE to 1350 or 1450. It's a course that I teach at Queen's University, and I'm going to be developing an online version of the course to share with, people in the public. And we will definitely address that particular issue, but its history and the story of Muslim or Islamic jurisprudence is part of the story of the broader development of the Muslim religious sciences that starts to happen towards the end of the first century of the Islamic era, where people start specializing. People that Marshall Hodgson calls the piety-minded groups start to refine their techniques in gathering and preserving the hadith statements of what the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, might have said or did that could be a basis or precedent for establishing, norms for Muslim believers and practitioners to follow. And that developed into a kind of more technical a discipline of using multiple sources, whether the Quran, those statements of Muhammad's hadith, the hadith, to forms of rational kind of analysis and scrutiny of evidence using analogistic reasoning and logic to try and apply principles derived from those sacred sources to new cases and new situations that weren't explicitly covered in those scriptural and extra scriptural sources. And also to use kind of concepts that developed in the methods or known as usul al-fiqh, the principles of jurisprudence, of legal understanding of which is what fiqh is, of attempting to understand, in other words, to understand what God's will for human religious and social organization would be. That they also developed concepts like consensus of the believers would be a principle that upon which law could be established. And so they developed this, what is known as the Sharia, through these kinds of techniques, and they crystallized into several different kinds of schools or orientations or rites, you could call, rites, rites, the madhab in the plural, madhab, around kind of key figures who initiated some new kind of like methodological principle, and so forth. And these schools kind of developed into the four major ones that survive in Sunni Islam in the second and third centuries. And so that's the kind of process by which it became more formalized into a discipline of knowledge and training through which Muslims could adhere to kind of practice of Islam in a kind of coherent, structured way. And that is, of course, a process that is coterminous and, in fact, necessary, you could say, for being a mass Muslim society. And that only does happen in like about the 3rd and 4th centuries, where the majority of peoples in what we would think of as the Near East, from the Nile to the Oxus, like the Central Asian River, the Nile to the Oxus, that kind of area of central Islamic lands that encompasses Egypt through Persia, that it's only after a few centuries that you have a majority of people who are Muslims, and they need a kind of coherent system of religious practice and law to kind of accommodate an organized social and religious life. And you could say, in some sense, that Islamic jurisprudence is kind of similar in some respects to the way in which rabbinic Judaism developed halakhic law through these people who studied texts of the Bible and other kind of extra scriptural discussions that were considered authoritative or important in the books of the Talmud, for example, that became a source for generating and establishing Jewish religious law, or the halakha. That's a somewhat parallel kind of process. Okay, that's a thumbnail sketch of like Islamic jurisprudence and its early development, without giving you any details of like the names of the figures and all that, but just the overarching process. Hopefully that's at least a little helpful, and maybe a teaser for a future online course that I hope to share with you. Been meaning to ask you, from Omar Jaziz. I reread Reza Aslan's No God But God. It seems like a good summary, a material history of Islam. Can you talk about it and your take, any critique? Well, interestingly, since we were just going over the history of Islam, at least in terms of the perspective of the development of Islamic jurisprudence, that I do have an interview with Reza Aslan about the 20th anniversary edition of No God But God. It's on this channel. You can go check it out. And there you can see that we had a really good dialogue and discussion. I appreciated his historical approach. And of course, as a historian, and of course also the fact that he was interested in portraying and representing different, what we might call, devotional streams or religious cultures within the broad kind of sense of Islam, which included, of course, Shi'i, theology and theology of history, we might say, and about the kind of authority of the imams as spiritual and religious guides and politically legitimate leaders of the Muslim community, who are the source of real authoritative guidance, as opposed to the Sunni tradition that has relied a lot more on the broad community of consensus and the transmitted reports through various kind of mechanisms and so on as the corpus of material that it interprets. And also Sufism, the Sufi mystical tradition. So it covers a lot of like useful and interesting things. I think it's a little bit like a kind of liberal's take on Islam and some of the more radical, kind of dimensions of its socialistic kind of basis, I would say, aren't as emphasized, you might say. And so that would be, I think it's very well written, and it's a really useful first kind of, for people who want to kind of have a first encounter with this tradition. I would say I kind of like it a little bit more, perhaps, and I might even use it in future classes, or at least parts of it. So I think it's quite good, and it's certainly worth reading. Um, we could go into in more greater detail things that I would do differently or I would want to emphasize, etc. But I would endorse, that it's a good, resource for people to read. Daiwo 5429 says, I got the Shahi. I think that's Sahih international translation. Seemed to be less popular version, but had a phrase with particular wording that I couldn't find in other English translations. Yeah, sometimes you'll find some translations are good for certain things or certain verses that they seem to render better. I'm not necessarily a fan of that one particularly. I think it can be good. The one I would say I don't like genuinely as a translation is the Yusuf Ali translation, which was very popular at a certain period of time and almost the dominant English translation that Muslim communities themselves used. And I think it was misleading. And it really is exactly the opposite of this work, in that it's stripped away the kind of traditions of interpretation of Muslims' understanding of their own sacred scripture to try and present a kind of very literalist, Salafist kind of understanding of the Quran. And, in many things, I have problems with this intellectual and religious trend of Salafism in modern Islam. Uh, let's see what else. I don't want to go too long. We still have quite a good audience. While you're here, why not like the stream so other people, will find out about it? I think we've been, having a pretty good discussion, and I really enjoy having some questions from you to respond to. So, share it. Subscribe, like the stream, share it on social media. You can retweet it right now. It's streaming on X as well. And subscribe to the channel if you're finding this useful. I've already had occasion to reference several other episodes that have information or analysis that's of value, I think. And so I think you should subscribe to the channel because there's a lot of great resources. I've had some amazing guests on and fantastic discussions, and also an opportunity like I do in office hours regularly, but especially now when I'm doing a solo stream, to answer your questions and engage directly with you, which is the most fun thing. Azadi says, my timeline is filled with angry Iranians demanding arrest of Zarif and Rouhani. Well, there had been, if you recall, actually, early on, I can't remember if it was before the war or right at the outset of the war. It might have been during the kind of chaotic riots that had been sponsored by, that had been built upon and infiltrated the genuine and legitimate kind of grievances that people articulated about the dire, economic situation and economic administration, some of which, of course, is a result, obviously, of sanctions regime and the intended and really nefarious manipulation of Iran's currency, admitted by the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, as something that they did and targeted. But that during that time when there were kind of violent, chaotic attacks on hospitals, clinics, banks, ambulances, fire trucks, and the shooting of quite a lot of police, Basij volunteers, and others, that there was a report that had suggested that Zarif and Rouhani had been taken under house arrest. And I never really got a really clear sense afterwards of whether that was a false report or whether there had been some kind of restriction on them or what had happened. But obviously he's free to write, articles undermining, in some ways, you might say, the consensus position of the current, governing political and military class, in Foreign Affairs magazine, of all places, to air these kind of suggestions. That is quite, interesting, that is still possible. Okay, so for all those who would say, oh, what a terribly repressive regime, yeah, okay, I mean, not every place is perfect. I would say, it's right now not been a great place for the last 2-3 years in particular, and it always hasn't been. But to be a pro-Palestine activist, or right now to be publicly supportive of Iran's right to self-defense and defense of its national sovereignty in the West, right? So, but here he is able to articulate these kind of critical positions and have a political position, and discuss it in public. Let's see, what else has come up. Let's take off that one. Yeah. I feel like, wow, this is really old stuff from the comments, because in answering some of your questions, we went along. Indeed, exactly. Zerubbabel 777 says exactly, Adnan, because empire doesn't want peace. Empire wants more empire/power, referring to, I think, the kind of naivete of the reformists in thinking that there was some rapprochement to be made. I mean, unfortunate as it is. That's the unfortunate thing, is that Iran has tried so many times to have peaceful relations, to negotiate, to find solutions, even in this most latest round of negotiations that took place right during the attack for the second time, when they were engaged in negotiations, nuclear negotiations with the United States. They had made all kinds of concessions and had come up with creative sorts of solutions to try and resolve the question of Iran's civilian nuclear program, and to ensure that there would be, mechanisms in place to prevent enrichment to a level where it could be weaponized, right? So they've bent over backwards many times, and there have been so many eras and periods of overtures. I remember Khatami's Dialogue of Civilizations. So it's not for lack of trying. It's just that it clearly is, the problem is not Iran. The problem that they are not the kind of irrational theocracy in this situation. There is, two other parties that are absolutely impossible, it seems, to placate, to satisfy through normal, reasonable, rational negotiations between sovereign states. That's the problem, is that empire doesn't work that way. Empire's nature is to seek the subordination of others, to extract value, for its ruling class. So indeed, so far, Iran has accomplished a lot despite the sacrifice. So that's the point. How many times looks environmental says, how many times do people have to touch the hot stove to stop wanting to be burned? Indeed. So Patmos Revelator wishes that they spoke Farsi. It's a beautiful language. I don't really speak it well. Unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to spend time immersed in an environment where Farsi of various varieties is the language spoken by the society. Because if you think about what has Afghanistan, which has many languages, but also Farsi, or what they call Dari, their version, their dialect of Farsi, has been, of course, subject to decades upon decades upon decades of terrible war. Tajikistan had a huge civil war and has been kind of a real problematic place. And of course, Iran has been under sanctions, anathematized, isolated. And it was only last December, just a few months ago, that I made my first trip to Iran, as many of you know, with my colleague and good friend from graduate school, Professor David Yagubian, who's been on the show many times. So let's see, what other kinds of questions might have come up. These are all from when I was talking about Zarif, and I think we've covered quite a few of the points about the reformists in Iran and about the Foreign Affairs article. Do you have, Omar Jaziz, do you have recommendations for an Islamic history overview? Yeah, he mentions reading Reza Aslan's thing. I mean, I will tell you, I haven't read a history of, gosh, what's the title? Looking at it on my bookshelf, I have it by Michael Cook, A History of the Muslim World, I think is the title, which is, about a year and a half old, and by a major kind of scholar from Princeton. I haven't kind of looked at that to see if that would be replacing, what I typically use. But I will tell you what I think is the best. It's not very readable in modern kind of language. I wouldn't consider it like well written in that kind of way that's like lucid and easy to kind of like a page turner, good narrative. But I think Marshall Hodgson's 3-volume The Venture of Islam, and in particular, the first 2 volumes, because the 3rd volume really was kind of unfinished. He died before it was fully edited and revised, but he had completed the first 2 volumes well. I would say that those, even though he wrote them in the 1960s, early 1960s, still really great. Of course, they're out of date with a lot of things. Research and scholarship has moved. Oh, it seems like there was a little problem with my Wi-Fi router. So I was just basically saying Marshall Hodgson's is great. I can recognize that it's not very readable, and it is really old. So I would say for I do use in my classes Albert Hourani's History of the Arab Peoples, and then I combine it with Richard Bullitt's Bulliet, Islam: The View from the Edge. These are also not particularly recent kind of textbooks and surveys, but I like them. I think they do a very good job balancing kind of different perspectives and approaches. But I will be reading this new Michael Cook, and there's also another new one, and I need to, for the course that I'm going to be teaching, The Making of the Muslim Middle East, that I'm revising and preparing, and for which I will prepare some kind of an online course experience. I have to kind of see if there are some new textbook surveys that would be better than the Hourani Bullet combination that I've typically been using, because students cannot handle the Marshall Hodgson that I really like. Okay, so that's my answer on that question. Is there a trustworthy site to give an overview of Shia and Iranian thought and reality from end colonial Epstein regimes? I don't know, for an overview of Shia and Iranian thought, that's kind of something that you would find in scholarship rather than kind of posted around on the internet as an internet site. But I could make some recommendations on things to read perhaps there. But what I would think is very exciting and interesting, and here it is on a website, so maybe I should revise that point, that I would suggest that if you want to understand something about, it's not that it's completely widespread in what everyone thinks, but it was so influential for a certain cadre of intelligentsias that were important in the revolution and many of its aspirations and hopes, that really revived a political orientation for Shi'i theology. Of course, that was also happening with the doctrine of Vilayat-e Faqih by Khomeini, but this was another kind of trajectory, you could say, and that is the work of Dr. Ali Shariati, who was a sociologist, thinker, seems to have been inspired in some ways by Marxism, also by Fanon. His works, a lot of them have been translated into English. And if you look up Ali Shariati, there's a website that has his speeches. And by speeches, it was like lessons that he gave in this institute. I'm blanking on the name of the institute, but in Tehran, where he would, kind of teach sort of public classes for people, and people recorded these and published them. And they've been, a lot of them have been translated. So Ali Shariati. So if you look up, his name is usually spelled like this. I've put that in the chat, Ali Shariati, and there's a good website dedicated to his speeches. I think that would be really interesting for people to study, and I'm interested in learning more. I've read some of them, but I had a great student who did a wonderful MA thesis on Fanon and Shariati and looking at their thought and interrelationship. So there's a lot there to be interested in. Yeah, I'd love to join your online course on Islam and Islamophobia and decolonization. Yes, I will be trying to develop some of those. Maybe over the summer, I'll begin developing, and hopefully for the next coming academic year, some of the courses that I'll be teaching, I would like to do in some version that is accessible online to a broader audience, not just the students in the classroom. So, as I said, we'll be looking into things like that. Question: Gaza still under siege and this is from Red Kitty, being attacked, and people are being killed and dying daily. How do you see things proceeding with the resistance there? I saw they completely rejected disarmament given the current conditions. Yes, well, there had been, I remember about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, that there was the first kind of public sort of military march or demonstration by Islamic resistance or resistance, fighters in public since the end of since the so-called ceasefire. As yet, they have not been demilitarized. They have not been disarmed, but they haven't been engaging in active combat the way they had been before. I think as what we're seeing overall is that the axis of resistance is being activated and engaged in the project of combating the empire, and that is also in Iraq, which has been a very active front. I don't think many people expected that they would be doing 87 combat operations in a day at some points, which has happened, and that they would have successfully essentially decolonized much of Iraq from US and NATO forces. They've been relocated to other parts, including in Kurdistan, in the north, in Erbil. But by and large, they have been, very active, and that's something of a surprise, because although the resistance forces and popular resistance forces or there's a particular way it's translated, but in Iraq, have been, as I said, extremely active and engaged, in the course of the Ramadan War, and entered very early on into an active phase of confrontation. Subsequent to that, the Islamic resistance in Lebanon launched a support front there as Israeli forces were massing for a cross-border attack. And that is an ongoing and very active site. I mean, if you read the news, and we're going to talk with Laith Maruf, we'll get, very detailed and up to date, as well as the historical, since the start of the Ramadan War, analysis of what's happened on the ground. And that has been, not just aerial and drone, kind of fighters and drones and missiles, but also, tanks and armored personnel carriers on the ground, and multiple attempted forays to try and invade southern Lebanon that have been resisted, by forces in southern Lebanon. That's an amazing kind of story to analyze what's been happening there, when Hezbollah was also thought to have been, severely weakened. And maybe it was, but it either was not as weakened as we thought, or has used the last 15 months where it has not, actively combated Israeli violations, over 15,000 of them, in southern Lebanon, until perhaps it used that time to rearm, re-equip, rebuild, refocus its strategy and its structure, to go back to being less of a kind of almost army, into a resistance organization fighting guerrilla war asymmetrically, and so on. So that's a kind of important point. And then Ansarullah in Yemen had announced that it would be actively involved. It chose its time, and recently has been also firing missiles and actively engaged. So, and they haven't yet taken other steps like they had before during the kind of most intense periods of the Gaza genocide to interdicting, marine traffic to Israel, to the port of Eilat on the Red Sea. They may yet, escalate to that. And so what we're seeing across these fronts is activation. And all I can say, not I would say let's kind of watch John Elmer's reports, on electronic intifada to really understand in detail, what's been happening. But it clearly seems that that's a front that could be active, as well. And these ones are really fundamentally, in some ways, in support with the people of Gaza and their resistance against settler colonial occupation, dispossession, and genocide. I mean, what we can say about the Ramadan War is that Iran is paying this price because they have remained in solidarity with the people of Palestine and have never abandoned them. And that is, part and maybe even principal to the reasons why they have suffered sanctions, subversion, and now war. So, a very important question that I would just put in the broader context and say that all of these fronts have clearly become, active and activated as a result of imperialist war on Iran that is now, as was promised, a regional war. Okay. I feel like there's so many other things, that you all have posted, and I'm just scrolling kind of madly to make sure that there isn't some kind of big point that I might have missed. But we are at 2 hours and 15 minutes on this stream. And so, at some point we'll need to wrap up, but I just so much enjoy your comments, your questions, and trying to think about what's going on in the world together with you that, maybe we'll do a little bit more, as I try and see what else might have been posted here on the stream. Yeah. So, I mean, I love sharing this information and analysis, and also learning from others and from you, my guests, from you in the chat, and points that you raise. I think that's wonderful. Oh, which works would you recommend of Ali Shariati to begin with? Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, he's got so many, kind of important things. Let me look up on that site what he has. I think, and I'm very interested in this one, is religion versus religion. That's something I definitely want to reread. But there's a number of books. I mean, there is also even What Is to Be Done, which I think, for this kind of audience here of anti-imperialist, kind of pro-Marxist, or at least Marxist, adjacent or informed or inspired, kind of community of people engaged in politics. It recalls, of course, Lenin's famous work, What Is to Be Done. And so it would be kind of interesting, if you are familiar with Lenin's work, to see, how, what Ali Shariati discusses there, and why he is framing this as in dialogue with Lenin, like what's at stake for him in that. And I think that would be kind of interesting, for people. But I think religion versus religion, that I kind of know more about because my student worked on it, is something that I was kind of very, very interested. You could say maybe something like Man in Islam is maybe a little bit more kind of broad and general approach to understanding Islam. That's a classic work. That's a very good one, perhaps. Also, Approach to Understanding Islam, where he kind of gives his interpretation of some key themes in this kind of turn towards a more politicized Islamic revival that is actually very different from the way in which other politicizing trends emerge, like, say, the Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafists. Very different and interesting for that reason. So another classic work of his that I would recommend is on the sociology of Islam. So those few works I would say are good places to start, and these tend to be fairly short, you know, pieces. So it won't be too difficult to check out one or two of those. Okay, so those are my thoughts and recommendations. What's the biggest difference between Shia and Sunni Islam? That I will refer you perhaps to go listen to my discussion on Revolutionary Left Radio that I also posted on my channel as an audio file. If you go and listen to the podcast version of the program, Libsyn, but you can get it on Apple, Spotify, is my discussion on the history of Iran, where I did talk about Shiism and in distinguishing it from Sunnism. I ultimately think that the sectarianism that has emerged and been politicized is very detrimental to what is a broader and necessary kind of just Muslim unity. There's so much that's shared, but there are some differences in terms of historical interpretation of the early history of Islam around the question of legitimate authority and guidance in both religious and political affairs. And Sunnis, did not feel that there had to be a specific successor. There should be a leader for the Muslim community, but that there didn't need to be a very specific successor to the status of the Prophet Muhammad's religious and political guidance. That era was over, and that then it was more about the kind of traditions that he had left, the Quran, which was a revealed text and guidance from God, and that anybody really could lead the Muslim community as long as they fit certain basic criteria and membership in that community. Whereas the people who became partisans, that's what Shia means, partisans, or the party of, or the faction or supporters of Ali, who was the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. And I made that mistake, in that 3-hour discussion when I was talking about it. I said nephew rather than cousin, as well as son-in-law. So correction there. But that he was the most suitable successor. He was as I said, cousin and son-in-law. He was the most suitable person to lead the Muslim community afterwards, and also that he had some kind of religious interpretive authority of the message of Islam that was not shared by others who may have been early companions, but that he had a sort of special status, and that this was inherited by subsequent descendants of the family of the prophet, who cherished a kind of intimate and close knowledge of these spiritual traditions and message of Islam, and passed it down to somebody who was known as the Imam, that is the guy, the kind of leader, both a religious and political leader. And so that's really kind of, in some ways, the fundamental difference. There's so much that could be talked about in that history and in the differences. But I would tend to say that the differences are less about the theological kind of questions than how they have been interpreted in contemporary, Muslim religious and devotional life for a long time, because the mainstream or the majority of Shia were what are called Imami Shi'is, or who recognized a line of 12 Imams before the disappearance of the 12th as a young boy, since these Imams were often persecuted and targets of political assassination and so on, as rivals to the established Muslim rulership of first the Umayyad dynasty, and then later, after the Abbasid revolution, the Abbasid dynasty. And these were people, who were threatened by this rival kind of orientation of political and religious legitimacy, particularly the political legitimacy. And so the 12th Imam disappeared, and then after enough time passed, there was the idea that perhaps this Imam would return, like a messianic kind of figure known as the Mahdi, who means the rightly guided one. at the end of time to lead the Muslim community back into justice and the right, kind of orientation. And so as a result, many have thought in the past that this mainstream form of Shiism was very quietist because it postponed, you might say, the active political kind of and religious contestation with the dominant Sunni tradition and rulership that was kind of in a period of waiting and of expectation, and therefore had turned principally to religious development, but not active contestation of political rulership. But none of that is relevant for the kind of contemporary Shi'i tradition that started to undergo reinterpretation by people like Ali Shariati, by clerics, scholars like Ayatollah Khomeini, Ruhollah Khomeini, who was, ideological progenitor, you could say, of this doctrine of governorship, vilayati faqih, governorship of the jurist, that kind of activated Shiism into a more profoundly activist form of Islam. And so modern Shi'i theology, under the auspices of these kinds of trends and thinkers, and as a result of the outcome of the successful Islamic revolution in Iran, has now been kind of really, you would say, transformed in many ways in its orientation from what people thought was this quietist, waiting for the end of time when the Mahdi would come, into a much more activist kind of revolutionary theology. So it's not really the theology in a kind of broad, essential, trans-historical sort of way that this is what Sunnism is, that's what Shiism is, and they have those characteristics and those essences. But they transform and can transform and develop historically in light of how they're interpreted and applied to changing circumstances of history. And so the quietist Shiism became revolutionary Shiism, right? So that's what I would say, just in brief. But I would refer people perhaps to that history of Iran, where I did discuss some aspects of the early history of Shiism and how it developed its distinctive identity as a sect of Islam, what distinguishes it from Sunnism. You know, uh, Osman Zafar 9826. It is just a master's thesis. It has not yet been published, but he's going to be continuing to work on it. I myself am interested in the topic of anti-colonial forms of Islam, and so there will be opportunities to write more about it. I think there was an interesting in Fidai Media author under the name, I think it was John Turner, wrote an interesting interpretation of Fanon for Gaza, because it was the 100th anniversary last year of Fanon's birthday, right? And so there were a lot of tributes and reflections. And of course, during the period of the Gaza genocide, Fanon's thought has seemed increasingly, important and relevant, right? And so this was an interesting article in Fidai Media that I would suggest people could look up, because at the end, it talks about Fanon's correspondence briefly with Ali Shariati. And in a recent talk that I gave at Franklin and Marshall College about Sufism and anti-colonial resistance over history, long period of history, I had occasion to also quote from that correspondence. So there's things like that one could kind of start to see the interconnections. Shariati translated Wretched of the Earth into Farsi. So there's a close kind of connection between them. in a panel with Gabriel Rockhill. Sunny FX1 is talking about that. If it was about Iran, that was actually in Philadelphia. And we have not yet published it on my channel, but it's been published on the Critical Theory Workshop and, of course, the Philadelphia Liberation Center, which is affiliated with the Philadelphia chapter of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, that was kind enough to host me in organizing this panel with a couple other colleagues, including Gabriel Rockhill, who convened it and was the chair, but also made some very valuable remarks. That is up on their site as well, and should be up on my site, should have been. But producer Sina is getting to it, and hopefully it'll be available on my channel really soon, and you can watch it there as well. If you're talking about that one more recently, though, I did do a discussion on office hours with Gabriel Rockhill when we had hosted him for his book launch of his very important book, Part 1, Volume 1 of the Intellectual World War, titled Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism. We had a book launch, and when he was here visiting in Kingston, Ontario, we had a live stream office hours episode that you can watch. And plus, I also interviewed him about that book earlier, and we called it The Imperial Theory Industry, which is something that he coins and has a discussion of. And so you can check out both those two episodes about his work, but then also this panel that took place in Philadelphia last week and was published just earlier this week. And hopefully will be published, as I said, on my channel here as well. You can check that out. Great comments from my co-panelists, Nazia Kazi and Adim Suhail, as well as, of course, Gabriel Rockhill, who convened it, and I made some remarks too, which maybe you will find interesting. So do check that out, especially here once it is on. So yes, I am here late, for you. That's okay. This is I'm glad people found this an interesting session. I think we're coming closer to the end here. And I do want to recommend, I think the last episode with Bikram Gill on Monday of Iran versus the Epstein Empire, I think was a really interesting episode. I thought the discussion was fascinating. Obviously, Bikram's remarks about China were very important and lucid. And he also talked a little bit about this revolutionary Shiite theology. And, I had some remarks as well, because it's a topic I've been thinking a lot about. And I discussed some of this also with Helia Dutari in that episode. That also came out very recently and that I would recommend to everybody. And I think that on the channel, the title for it was Iran at War, Sovereignty Against Empire with Helia Dutari. So do look that up. Those are, I think, were two recent, very important conversations with politically insightful guests who know what they're talking about, both in terms of imperialism and the world system, in the case of Dr. Bikram Gill, and both that question, but also really what's happening inside Iran and observations about, the revolutionary kind of moment that they're in and the consequences of that with Helia Dutari. I really, kind of recommend those. So yeah, I think I'm going to kind of wrap things up because we've been going 2 hours and 30 minutes. But I do want to ask you, if you could, here in our final concluding remarks, to like the stream, share it, and to subscribe to this channel, but also to see if you could participate, in the fundraiser for Gaza students to take my class and other classes that are being organized as small private online courses through MITx, a wonderful program by graduate students who are pro-Palestine activists that they organized to offer online courses to help students suffering not only genocide, but on top of it, scholasticide. And so even though they have so far survived the genocide in Gaza, their education has been terribly disrupted, and they faced so many incredible challenges, but yet are deeply committed to trying to continue their learning, continue their education. So I've put the link one more time into the chat, and I really so much would appreciate if you would join me in making a small donation. We will be continuing to raise money for them over the next several weeks, but a little bit each time is really helpful. And I just want to share the screen where this tab is, of the fundraiser. So it's here, and that's what it looks like. We're at 9,140, and so it has gone up a couple $100 or so in the time that we've been together here online. And I see some people from the chat who I recognize who have made recent donations. I really, really thank you, including Eva Wojcik, Buzian Brahim. There are anonymous people, Rachel Boyer, Ben Stewart, and others. And so I'm going to, once I just pop off the stream and close it, I'm going to go in and make another donation. And I hope you might join me in that. It's such a pleasure to be with you, at the end of the week, and to have these conversations, to see what you're talking about in the chat, to try and respond to some questions and have that interaction. I just love that interaction, and I appreciate you being here very much. And it's really my favorite time of the week, I have to say. Live stream office hours is really my favorite time in the week. And unfortunately, next week I will be traveling, and I won't be able to do a office hours live stream next week, though there is, as I said, a live stream on Monday with Laith Maroof, who I think you all will be excited to, hear from. Of course, he's all over lots of other places too, but I'm hoping we might have an interesting conversation that also contributes some new insights to the work that he's doing with Free Palestine TV, and as a geopolitical commentator and analyst who loves history. So we'll probably get into some discussions of history as well. So do tune in 10 a.m. Eastern time on Monday for that. And go check out the recent episodes, as I said. And there's other things that are coming up. So do share, and subscribe to this channel. If you can support, that's great. But otherwise, the main thing is please donate to Spox for Gaza, the third round. And so the students can take guerrilla history, anti-colonial resistance, history theory, practice. So until next time, and there will be other office hours afterwards, we'll return, but next week we won't be here. But until next time, peace with solidarity, peace with justice and solidarity. As always, free Palestine, and all the best to you until next time.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.